right, so with today's topic, pretty much is going to be diving into racial color blindness. Now, I don't want to assume anyone's already set opinions about it. So I guess we can just kind of go around and share. It'll be share time. How about that? And then I just have a few points that I want to mention or bring up just to kind of initiate some conversation. Uh, so, my idea of it to start off is, I guess, with racial color blindness, it just posed another excuse of ignorance. Just not the, I guess you could say, willingness to not openly and realistically address that certain minority groups go through particular disparities in society. And for those to say that we live in a post-racial society is untrue. I feel that, racial stigmas and stereotypes and discrimination, sometimes even acts of violence, are even more so covert than they ever been. Um, and I think that's, compounded with, mass media and social media and different outlets that get um, things like this to surface quickly. But that being said, I recognize that and I empathize with those that truly don't understand why we can't just outright ignore a person's race and just see them as a human. And you would think that would be the appropriate response to wanting to have a better society of just people being, seen as equals. And to a certain extent, that's fine, but it still does not drive the needed conversation, and albeit a very difficult one, to really expose the issues that not only Black people have, but other minorities, Asians, Hispanic, there have you. So that's just my initial thoughts. Anyone else?
I've kind of talked about this a little bit with a couple people since you brought up the topic, or since you posted it, I should say. And there are definitely questions as to why we can't just kind of move past recognizing differences in race, or when somebody says, say, as a Black person or as a brown person or as a Hispanic, whatever, this is what I experience, right? Or when somebody puts forward as part of their identity, what color they are, what ethnic background they are, like why that is still important. Because there's definitely people that would say that it's inherently divisive to say, as a Black person, this is what I experience, when it should just be, as a person, blah, 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 this is what I experience. But there's definitely a lot of questions about that. And there's people that don't understand that it's not that people choose to be separated out by race and color. Like, this was placed upon them by other people. And the one that always pops in my head is, we have a whole indigenous population in the US that we call Indians, when they never had anything to do with India, but we just decided that this is who you are. We're going to take your land and put you on reservations. And, if you say, as an Indian or as a Native American, this is my experience, we're going to say, well, we're past that now. Even though, they've been subjugated for hundreds and hundreds of years. You can't just kind of brush that aside and ignoring that those that we do look at people differently based on their color or background, that they're treated differently, ignoring that that's a fact. And in a lot of cases, or most cases, is it necessarily ignoring the existing problems as well with that.
Yeah, some would argue that it's very inappropriate to ask such a question saying, does race happen to impact a certain situation? People would think that just further stigmatizes minority groups, and it puts, white people on the defensive. And then it just, that in itself just furthers interracial conflicts in themselves too. There have been multiple times where even people from my own family would say, Black people aren't racist. And I find that completely untrue, because there exists some internal conflicts within, and I'll just speak for my race, Black people, that exists if you are a certain shade of Black, light skinned versus dark. If you present yourself in a certain way that is not, a Black qualifier. For instance, if you don't listen to certain kinds of music, or if you don't hang out in certain hoods, or if you don't, represent yourself in certain groups or societies. But of course, the general umbrella for Black people is that they're religious, and that's just, a whole other conversation around that. But there's so many factors that comes with race plus a societal issue, meaning you are this while doing this, and that outcome would turn out differently for you. So if I'm Black while driving and I get pulled over, then I will have a completely different outcome versus a white guy or a Hispanic person while driving, and their outcome is different.
I don't think that you can necessarily say kind of blanket statements like that, where I wouldn't even say, from my limited understanding of the statistics on all this, that it's even the majority of the case where the experiences are different. I think most of the time, in the majority of the cases, it's a similar experience. But we do have highly publicized, like many instances of Blacks and other minorities being wrongfully aggressed in these being when they're just routine stops, or when they're getting shot when they're unarmed. So these are the cases that get publicized. So there's definitely a public perception that this happens all the time, or it only happens to minorities. I don't know if the data necessarily supports that, but this is kind of what we see across the culture now in the media and getting all of the attention. So it's easy to assume that this is basically happens every day. If you look around enough, you can find stories of this happening, fairly often.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if the numbers, like the actual raw data, support it or not. But like you said, with the ability to basically give something national attention with a single tweet or a Facebook post, it kind of all depends on what what we want the public narrative to be, because it's easy to filter out the stuff that doesn't fit.
Mm. Very stated. Ursus, Tell?
I don't understand what Justin. I understand what Justin was trying to say. I don't understand his larger point.
Oh, I was just, I kind of just rudely interrupted Jenna, saying that her experience would be different as a Black woman than it would be as, say, a white man being pulled over or confronted by the police, or whatever the situation may be. And I just wanted to say that I think that we think that it happens far more often than it does. But I mean, that's not to say it doesn't, right? Or that it shouldn't be addressed, but that we have this perception that this happens every day, or all day, every day, or every instance is totally different, or driven mainly by race.
Okay. I'm still not really seeing the larger, like, what are you, I don't, is there a larger point to what you're saying?
No.
Yeah,
I was just.
Say hi. Give him a wave.
Well, let me ask, maybe this will help me. Do you think that people, let's just say people of different races, right? Even though we could probably ask this question for anything, do you think they experience the world differently?
Yes.
Okay.
Even if they have the same experience as a person of a different race, or say a black man has every interaction is the same as if it was with a white guy, they still have a whole history that plays into how they experience the world, or perceptions of their race and culture that affects everything. So even if all of the external interactions are the same, they're not coming from the same starting point. So it's necessarily different, I think. And I wouldn't say that they're the same. I'm just saying even if they were the same, it would still be different.
Okay, and I would agree with you, which I think further confuses like what you were trying to say with your last point, because it sounded like what you were saying was that the different experiences, particularly when we deal with race, probably can be minimized, at least in some way, because it's probably overblown by our perception of the media. But you seem to agree that people do have different experiences based on social characteristics like race. So I just don't get, like, it just really confused me, because it felt like if you were going to go that route, you needed to make like a bigger point. And I'm just confused, I guess.
No, I just kind of wanted to push against the generalization that it's kind of necessarily different, right? Like, and I was mainly just addressing the kind of like the public interaction side of it. So if somebody gets pulled over by a cop, or confronted by, some rednecks with a shotgun, that it's not necessarily going to be different based on race. The latter obviously is, but kind of losing my train of thought on that. But I think it's the major differences are, or from situation to situation, is far less common than we think, but it's still, what we see and hear all the stories about. Well, like you said, it's kind of, some of it's a little overblown, but it wasn't really a bigger point there.
I mean, I do think that, like you said, that people do experience the world differently based on social characteristics. And I think that's particularly true in America, though I don't think that's unique at all to America, because in particular, when we're talking about race, it's been a essential characteristic in our construction of society, right? And I don't just mean like the big thing we always mention, which is slavery. I mean, your racial category has historically been an important characteristic for, like, even your legal and political rights in America. Mm-hmm. Like, even it may feel like it was a long time ago, right? But there's still people alive who lived during that time period where it wasn't. And I feel like it's very difficult. So the reason I thought that this topic was interesting is because I've heard certainly lots of people say that. In fact, I heard someone say it on the show last week, right? And the reason that I tend to think that it's an interesting statement that people make is because there are several ways they can mean that, right? Like, they can literally mean, I just don't see race, right? It's just not a thing I see. And so this is not going to be a strong sort of argument. I don't believe them. But like, now, then we just get into arguments about like what your interstate mind, right? Like what are your thoughts? And that's not like a real argument you can win. But the reason that I don't believe them is because we live in a society where race has been a characteristic that could determine whether you could have been a citizen, what your property rights were, what your political rights were, and to people who are still alive today, right? Which means they taught people that are still alive today, who taught people that are still alive today, right? So the idea in my mind that someone could be so post-racial that they have not absorbed any of that teaching is, to me, an impossibility, right? But to be clear, I'm also saying that it's not really an argument I would get into, because then you're just into like, well, what are your real thoughts, right? And then people just say, oh, no, that's not what's really going on in my mind. And that's not really an argument you can win. But there are sort of bigger things that people sometimes mean when they say I don't see race, that you can argue, right? Because they do have things that you can study other than just what are the inner motivations of this person. So, I mean, I think... Yeah, I think since before I started wondering what that meant before, I was asked what I think. I think why this idea, when people say I don't see race interesting, to start with is just I don't believe them, right? That's not where I want to leave this, but I thought other people could talk about it. Do you think I'm wrong? Again, I'm not going to offer a lot of defenses for it, right? Because in the end, just interstates, right? I can't force someone to say that you're lying about your thoughts, but it seems impossible to me.
Well, what if they are kind of intentionally not analyzing that when on an individual level, like they're choosing to be post-racial rather than they just happen to not ever have been aware of, how our society is composed.
So they're purposely putting on blinders to
Yeah.
get past all that.
Well, then at the most charitable, right, they're at least being incorrect, right? Because they do see race. They're just actively doing their best to avoid any consequences of that.
Right.
So at the most charitable, I think that they're being somewhat confused, but still wrong, right? Still, I don't believe them.
Well, right, but I think you will hear, and like I've heard people say that they like we said, they intentionally ignore it or put on blinders or choose to believe that it's not a differentiating characteristic or something that should be taken into account from individual to individual when say looking at a resume or looking for government programs or something like that, like that it shouldn't be an issue. I mean, we know it is, right? And like you said, that they're wrong, but it's almost like like aggressively naive or intentionally like over hopeful, or I don't know how to describe it, but they've convinced themselves that the best way forward or to get into a post-racial society is to just pretend that we're already there.
Right. And we can talk about how I also think that those people are wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But to be clear, they are still seeing race. Like, so right now, I'm just concentrating on the inner motivation, right? The one that I think is like the weakest, because there's no point in arguing with people about what's really going on in their heads. Mm-hmm. So at the most charitable, right? This person, when they say, I don't see race, what they mean is actually, well, I actively fight against the idea of using race in any of my judgments on other people. That's like the most charitable. They're still like seeing race, right? So even at the most charitable, all they're doing is saying like an incorrect statement. It's still they're still wrong.
Yeah.
Hey, Vox.
Oh, hello.
Hi.
Is this working?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Okay, cool.
Can you hear us?
Yes. Okay.
So I feel like that just sets up a defensive mindset. Like it's either one, they're actively pushing aside and wanting to accept post-racial views, or there is no race whatsoever, or they just don't completely see it because maybe it's fear that, you know, certain groups of people would get this unearned advantage over others. Because if you say like, oh, this person deserves this because they're Black or Asian or whatever, then you're giving them an unfair advantage. And, you know, I often have heard, even to my face, that a white person would fear that because they feel like they are not being treated fairly when another minority is getting something that they feel that is unearned. And another side of it could be that, you know, okay, they flat out don't see race. So that just further pushes the goalposts of ignorance, right? It doesn't acknowledge what minorities presently experience and what they have been experiencing for years, for as long as America has existed. And I'm just focusing on America. And it just totally just further drives away from the conversation of trying to have this difficult talk surrounding this. So I'm wondering if they're wrong because they are driven by fear, that they don't want to be seen as always trying to be on the defensive of not talking about race or not putting race in every situation.
Well, what's driving or what's motivating their mindset in terms of making the claim that they don't see race is somewhat less important to me. Sure, fear could be a motivating factor in terms of attempting to.
I think I would have described myself as a post-racial person before really giving it some thought.
Sure. Do you not
I'm
hear me?
realizing that's not the case.
He doesn't.
But yeah.
He's not. I don't.
Sorry. I'll have Tub finish this point and then you'll go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. You know what? I can't hear Tub. That's probably the problem.
Oh,
sorry about that.
That's okay.
I thought I was missing somebody.
Go ahead, Tub.
But the idea, so one of the fears, of which I think there probably could be a few, again, I don't find the analysis of the motives the most interesting question, but you had mentioned one of the fears could be that they're afraid of someone getting an unearned advantage. And we had, well, you had previously, I wasn't on that one, talked about privilege as a concept, right? Which is a socially unearned advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Socially unearned advantage, they're relational. They generally come from groups that have more power in society. So I would even say, so this whole time, right, I've just been saying that those people are wrong, right? Mm-hmm. In this case, they'd even be wrong about that because someone would already be getting an unearned advantage as sort of the default dominant group. And the fear that they will not be a group getting the unearned advantage, or rather that any group is getting an unearned advantage, is just wrong because someone already is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, at best, they're just afraid of the unearned advantage moving to a different group.
Huh. Okay.
I think something that also plays into that is the white fragility, which is basically, from what I understand, white people, like our inability to handle or to reasonably deal with the facts surrounding this, and to recognize the problem and to talk about it openly. So we get defensive and kind of pretend it doesn't exist. Because it's just easier to ignore the problem. So if we pretend that it's not there, maybe it'll just go away on its own.
But we've, for years, have done that, and it doesn't go away. I mean, there have been changes in laws and policies to make it less, you know, violent and discriminative, maybe. But the more that it keeps not being talked about, it still continues to be a problem. Go ahead, Ursus. I saw you on mute.
So because I actually used to hold these views about not understanding that you see race, and in my experience, a lot of what I was taught regarding this was that to admit things like seeing race, or to admit things like white privilege, was to admit to being a terrible, violent racist. It was like saying, I actively hate these people, I am a terrible person, and I'm admitting to it. And I think it was equated that way to me for probably negative reasons. Like, people just didn't want to take responsibility for the fact that they do have cognitive biases, and that that these things do still affect our lives, regardless of whether or not we would like them to. But I think that that's a position that a lot of people are coming from when they're coming from a lack of education. And I think sometimes, because people don't understand what these words means, it just scares them. Like the way that the words sound are just terrible. Or if you don't know what it means.
Yeah, I agree. So I think I had a question for you and I instantly forgot. Sorry. But sure, I would agree with that. Maybe the wording, or just the very idea of race itself is just, enough to drive a person to just want to purposely ignore it or not talk about it. So I'm curious, because I know Tub kept saying these people are wrong. And I don't know if you've already clearly addressed why they're wrong, but if you can go ahead and tell us, why do you think they're so wrong when they tell you that they don't see race?
I mean, I thought of that. I explained like multiple ways I think they're wrong. The most basic is just they do see race, right? So, and they were wrong came later when we talked about more charitable interpretations of what they meant. I started out saying that I don't believe them, right? That I actually think they're lying. Although, to be clear, I also said that it was like the weakest argument, because in the end, all you're doing is arguing about inner motivations. There are other ways that I think are stronger to talk about how the statement "I don't see race" and what it could possibly mean. The arguments against it are much stronger. And some of the things that you've said have alluded to it, that by not addressing issues of race, you can't really address the issues that affect race. But I think if we are moving on from just inner motivations, from just people just saying like what's going on in their head and not being able to argue with them about what's going on in their head, I think one thing that people often mean when they say don't see race is not necessarily that they're saying that they literally don't see race, but rather they think that we live in a society where race no longer plays a significant factor. So when they say, I don't see race, what they're really saying is society doesn't really see race. And that, I think, is a much stronger thing you can argue against, because there are more objective things as opposed to just inner motivations that you can point to.
Right. I was just going to say it would be more difficult to argue with a person that takes a more relative stance, where they themselves don't see race as a deciding factor of a certain person when it comes to either hiring them or speaking to them, what have you. Welcome back, Kigler, now that you're at your computer. Vox, do you have anything to add? I'm sure you do.
I mean, if we're going with the stronger claim
Mhm.
where the statement is an attempt to encapsulate some view of society as a whole. I think we can go even further to say that the statement is more saying that I don't, or that your oppression does not exist. And
Mhm.
I think that's that's the strongest claim. One of the strongest claims that you can make is that oppression or subjugation by race or ethnicity, nationality, whatever terms you want to use, like using that phrase just makes it seem like it just doesn't exist. It's a type of skepticism about whatever group's problems. I think that you can definitely make a lot of arguments against the statement if we interpret it that way.
Right. Well, what I meant, I mean, that is largely what I meant by the stronger argument rather than claim. Because if someone says, I don't see race, and what they're arguing is, look, I don't see race, I'm not racist, I don't see race, then my saying, yes, you do, is just us arguing about what's going on inside your mind. What are your motivations? And, you know, you can have those arguments, but they go nowhere. But if they are arguing about the feature of a social world that, again, like society, in fact, is not racist, or society doesn't see race, well, those are things that you can have stronger arguments against.
Mhm.
And that's what I meant by having the stronger arguments against that version of I don't see race.
Mhm.
But what you do, I think a better exploration would be like what happens after. Actually, when does the whole "I don't see race" thing pop up? Usually, and it seems that it usually pops up when it's time to talk about racial issues. That's when the whole "I don't see race," right? It's like, well, at that point, it's not about whether or not you see race. That's where I think that Tubbs' explanation seems to come in a lot better. Is that if I'm trying to bring up the problems of racism and you utter, I don't see race, well, I'm not talking about whether or not you see race. I'm talking about that societal aspect. So I think I'm just trying to give our listeners or people watching like some examples of when that phrase even comes up.
Yeah, that was part of a conversation I had about this, where if we talk about the Ahmaud Arbery case, where clearly some aspect of that was racially motivated, and to say I don't see race, or we shouldn't recognize race differences, or whatever it may be. Like you said, you may not see it, but those people definitely did, right? There's no doubt about it. So we have to say we recognize this, we see it, and we see how other people use it to treat people differently, and it has to be addressed. If you ignore it, this thing just goes on forever, because the people that are the one out here causing problems, or the in legislature, or whatever, wherever the problems come from, they're not ignoring it, they're seeking it out. So and to ignore it is to just let those problems persist.
Exactly. Like if you say that, if we take the recent case and we say, well, this wasn't a race thing, right? It wasn't a race thing, or I'm not seeing race in this situation. That's an even better empirical showing of how that phrase can be used to just perpetuate this same racist garbage, right?
Certainly. I had some identifying points, but I'll. Oh, go ahead, Ursus. I'm sorry.
I did I took a bit of notes on this, and I found some college websites that talk about the idea of colorblind ideology or colorblind racism were the terms that they used specifically. And some of the points have already been brought up, but under like consequences and types, some of the things that they covered were like how some people do. So there are key terms such as liberalism, naturalism, cultural racism, and minimization. And the core ideas were that while a lot of people may claim to be colorblind, many people claim to do so at different levels and for different reasons. So there's that weak position of not wanting to acknowledge race because you hope it will go away. Thinking that it could be a solution to not acknowledge it, which would be something along the lines of liberalism. And then there's naturalism, which is the belief that racial inequality and racial conflict is unavoidable and can't be, like, you can't do anything about it. It's just the way it is. And then there was cultural racism, which was just to blame the group that is experiencing oppression for the oppression. So it would be like saying, well, if African-American teenagers didn't want to get harassed by the cops, they shouldn't dress in hoodies and suspicious clothing type thing. And it would be to make some sort of false distinction, saying that somehow they are causing this. And then minimization would be this idea that it was a lot worse in the past, and that because it's better, you should just deal with it because it doesn't need to be solved. It just needs to be better than it was.
So a lot of that material about colorblind racism and colorblind ideology comes from the work of a sociologist by the name of Eduardo Bonilla Silva. He wrote a book called Racism Without Racists. I think the ideology of colorblind racism or something like that. But the basic premise, Ursus demonstrated a lot of techniques, but the basic premise of the idea was that in the past, we had a racist structure in society, a racist power structure that you could openly talk about, right? So you could be openly racist, and it was okay and within the social norms. But the politics of society have become such that being associated directly with racism is now a detriment, right? So you don't want to be racist, right? So one of the things you talked about earlier about the fear white people might have, I thought it was going to come up, but I don't think I heard you say it, was about being called racist, right? What Eduardo Bonilla Silva says is that same racist power structure still exists, but since the language and the ability to talk about it has changed, so too the language must change. And so colorblind racism, using a lot of the techniques that Ursus just talked about, helps maintain the same power structure without ever having to admit that someone's racist. So in this book, Racism Without Racists, he goes through a lot of interviews with white people, specifically from Michigan, because he was in, where was he? He might have been in Dearborn at the time. He was at a university in Michigan. I don't remember which one. One of the ones one of the interviews that always stuck in my mind the most was of this old white woman, because it was about interracial dating. And basically her interview went something like this. Hey, look, I'm not racist. I don't have anything against two people of different races dating. But, I don't think they should. I don't think they should have kids because I'm really worried about what will happen to the kids or what they'll experience in life because, it's just not easy for kids. So I don't think they should. So in the end, what he points out is like, look, in the end, this would be the same in terms of function as someone saying, oh, don't mix the races. But in her statement, right, not only was she not racist, basically she said no one was racist, but still don't race mix because something bad could happen to those kids, right? So this colorblind ideology, according to Eduardo P. Silva, is sort of what promotes this idea of I don't see race, because it helps maintain the same power structure without ever having to admit that you are supporting the power structure. And of course, what he says is what you have to do is actively be anti-racist in order to dismantle the system. Just in case you were wondering what he said the solution was.
And so many times that I've heard that same type of example of what that lady said. And when I, early on in this, when I mentioned internal racism, and I give an example of, Black, because I'm Black. So so many times from my own family, they would implicitly say that, stick within your own, because that's how you will only be able to be equally yoked. No one outside of your race would understand how and what a Black woman goes through. And so to date outside your race, to mix with something else causes a danger, not only for yourself, but for your children. And, because that danger, even though, and we don't outrightly say that there is no racism, like obviously within the Black culture, we recognize, discriminatory things almost on a daily basis, no matter wherever you happen to live in this country. But to add on to that is if you do anything that's not within your own race, especially when it involves relationships, you are just giving the advantage of that other race, and you're furthering disadvantaging your own race. You're furthering not supporting your own race because you're going outside of that. And so there's not only, I'm saying all this because I see and know this and recognize the standard of, how white people would say that they don't see race. But it's even more of an issue for me when I hear internally how Black people perceive other races, mainly white, or unfortunately what my stepfather says, clear folk, see or say as far as, other races, and how much they don't want to further disadvantage their own. So they further push and say, don't do this outside of your race because you're going against us. And that's harmful in itself.
It kind of ties into a type of tribalism about, like a tribalism about culture. I have my own anecdotes, is that I was dating a white female, and there were a lot of times where her mother would say things like, I hope y'all aren't thinking about children because they're going to have a hard life. And it's like, But then on my father, he would be like, what they do doesn't really mix with what we do. And I was like, I don't understand what you mean. Well, it's that cultural tribalism. It's like, well, they do weird stuff. We don't do weird stuff because we're Black people and they're white people. And I was just like, well, that's a way to be racist again, without even saying it. It's irritating.
Yeah.
It's really.
Well, we don't claim Florida man either, okay?
Yeah, that whole, like I was saying in the beginning, that whole statement when Black people say, oh, Black people can be racist because we are, people are racist against us all the time. I call bullshit, because we are definitely, in that example, in my example, in Vox's example, that's completely racist.
Well, part of that is how you define racism. There's a movement to have it necessarily contain power, like a power aspect to it, right?
Yeah, I used that broadly. I did, yeah. Marginalized.
Clockwork Rex says he has a okay argument race for colorblindment. argument for race color blindness. Well, all right. Well, when you put it up, we'll see it.
Yeah. Well, I'm interested to see what exactly that is. Giggler, did you have something? Any thoughts?
No, I just wanted to apologize for over talking earlier.
Oh,
For some reason, I could hear everybody but Tub.
Yeah, if you couldn't hear him, it's not your fault.
Yeah, apologies.
No, you're fine.
I'm pretty sure that you were saying that you don't see race, and you want to explain why when you were over talking though.
I was gonna yammer something about being like super white bread, and I bumped into Jenna on Discord. Was it 3 or 4 days ago? And we were talking about this topic, and I was talking about how I'm a hiring manager, and like race just, it seems to me, doesn't even. I feel like I'm colorblind when it comes to hiring, but after talking to Jenna, I thought about it for a bit, and I realized that as much as honestly, I really don't care that much about race, to the extent like in job who I'm hiring, I'm really convinced of that. I remember my wife and I, who are fans of lavish Broadway type shows, we went to see Wicked recently at the Pantages Theater in LA. Not recently, God, this is like 5 years ago. But the male lead was played by a black man. And that struck me as odd. And yeah, and I didn't even, at the moment I was watching the show, I thought, well, that's a weird casting. You know, it's just like, it did occur to me, hey, he's a black guy, that role should be a white guy. But it was only after.
I'm sorry, you said Wicked?
Yeah, Wicked. Yeah.
The lead role's a woman, though.
Well, no, the lead male role is the Scarecrow.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
he's not really the. All right, sure.
Yeah. So when this guy, because we'd seen, this is the second time we'd seen the show at the same theater years apart. And so when this guy comes out on stage and it's black guy, it's not what we were expecting. And so I had a reaction to that, which wasn't like, oh, that's wrong, but I recognized, hey, that was supposed to be a white guy. So clearly I'm not colorblind. It was kind of the realization I came to looking back on it.
That's interesting, because what would drive you to assume that that's supposed to be a white guy? Because
exactly, yeah,
that's the question, right?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So yeah, like after talking to you about it, it really made me reflect on that and realize that even somebody like me, who, again, as white as you can get, really does think I'm sort of colorblind, obviously isn't. If I noticed that curveball that came at me to some extent.
And it's not like I haven't made those type of perceptions either. I'm trying to like recall an instance where I have, but I believe you when you say you don't. I mean, as much as it sounds wrong to me, I believe you when you say you don't recognize a person's race based on how you're hiring. So in a sense, you're pretty much saying you give equal opportunity to whoever you're trying to hire, as long as they meet the proper criteria of that set position, then they get the job, whether they be black, white, whatever. So I empathize and recognize what it means to you when you say you're colorblind in that fact. But I feel like it still sounds wrong, and it feels wrong to me because how do I want to say this? I don't know if, well, I won't assume that you're purposely disregarding.
Don't worry about offending me. I don't get offended.
No, well, thank you. I'm not trying to. I feel like that further I don't know, pushes away some ignorance of what it means for that minority person to get into a particular position to where they themselves may actually feel like they don't deserve that position because of the color of their skin.
Yeah.
I've certainly felt that way numerous times. You know, it's the whole factor of making sure that, you know, not only do you feel comfortable, not only do I try to want to perceive myself as feeling comfortable in my own skin, but to make sure you're feeling comfortable in my presence,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I want you to recognize that, you know, I'm Black and you empathize and understand, maybe not truly understand, but you empathize enough to where I'm coming from. But of course, I want you to look at me for my merits, and not just because, or pity me because, oh, I'm Black, I better just give her this position, right?
Yeah. Maybe to take race out of it just a little bit. When I took over the team that I manage currently, there was 11 males and 1 female on the team. And I kind of wanted to hire another female so we wouldn't have just 1 female on the team. But it didn't feel right to me to tell HR I'm looking for a female candidate, even though I was looking for a female candidate to increase team diversity. Is that a way to say it? I don't know if you know where I'm going with that. But
No, I do.
In that moment, it seemed like it would have been a good thing, though, because you would have been able to open up more perspectives when it comes to approaching whatever thing that was going to be approached by that team.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because then we can make a distinction between just hiring for diversity, like just because, and hiring so that we can increase unit cohesion by having extra perspectives.
Yeah, and that's actually where, to their credit, HR and my company really helped me out. Is I said, I want to hire another female so we don't have just 1 female on the team. And so the HR partner, she's typing as I'm talking, and she goes, "So you want to increase team diversity?" Yes, I want to increase team diversity. So, but it was a weird thing to recognize that I'm now looking at candidates based on I'm preferring somebody who identifies as cisgender, and I'm always going to have that bias to some extent. How much am I aware of it? You know, and maybe if I'm trying to be unaware of it, that's the worst thing I could do. And maybe I should really be making sure I'm aware of the differences between people, whether it be race or gender or whatever the case may be.
Not to divert from your point, Giggler, because I kind of want to talk a little bit more on that too. But Clockwork Rex wrote something interesting. He pretty much said, if this sounded gross, so be it. We are all the same race, human. If we were all skinned, we'd have no different colors. We'd all be the same color, red. I don't even know how to respond to that. I'm sorry.
I mean, that's kind of what we were talking about earlier, right? Where you can argue that genetically we're all similar enough to where if we didn't live in the society we live in, and if civilization didn't come about the way that it did, then we could, if we were starting fresh, we could just say, hey, we're all the same, right? These skin differences are arbitrary, blah blah blah, but that's not the case. From science recently, we know that genetically we're very similar, right? There's no significant or there's no like real differences, biologically or genetically between any of the races, or backgrounds, colors, whatever you want to call it. And we know that, but that doesn't change how society views people or treats people. it can kind of give us a path forward or something to look towards and or an argument to use against how people are being treated, but it doesn't change the fact that that's the way it is.
Right. And I definitely don't want to belittle Rex's statement. That's beautiful. It really is. It really is beautiful that you see everyone as the same. And, but unfortunately, that's not the case. Just like Justin was saying, in reality, a person's skin color, a person's ethnicity, a person's gender, all of that determines how they're perceived and how far they can get in life. And then Vox, you said you wanted to address aesthetics. What did you?
Yes, he says here. Does that actually increase diversity? Adding another of a group. Clearly, that person would bring things to the table that aren't already represented, but woman/female isn't the newly introduced thing in this scenario. Well, I think so. Here's the problem with the way he's using represented is that just because I sit at a table with a bunch of people doesn't mean my opinion or my views are actually being represented. I could be sitting there and people could still just continue as if I'm not there. Or they could be like, oh, that's cool, Vox, and then continue. When you have someone else there, the likelihood of you being reduced lowers because now you have another person that might share your ideas. They may not, but there's also this, I guess if we want to look at it like a type of democracy, I guess, is that now there are more people that possibly have your vote and are possibly able to bring something similar to what you're trying to say without it being drowned out by the voices of other people. If me and Jenna are at a table with a bunch of other people, we're going to come at it from, let's say we're coming at it from a shared history of something. If it was just me, well, they probably not going to listen. But if it's me and her, it's like, yeah, now we have a stronger voice because we're together. We're unified in some way.
Yeah. When you said that, I thought of political voting blocks. Like if your voting block isn't big enough, you're just going to get ignored. When you have a significant number of people that are rallying around a single subject, then your voices get heard. But just having one voice that it doesn't necessarily get you anywhere. If it's not, if they don't see it of having enough support from other people.
Yes,
I mean, well, we're adding we can label it diversity aesthetics by saying that we're adding more diverse views to it, or we're adding more people with alternate views instead of just one view by a dominant group. If I want to, because now I could add a lot of conditionals onto that, but that would be a long definition for diversity, which I don't want to do. But let's just say we're adding more people with certain views, and we're adding different histories to that as well. We're diversifying the histories as well.
Yeah, I agree with Vox there that, me going from a team of 11 males, 1 female to a team of 10 males, 2 females, I feel like that increased diversity. Representation, I guess, maybe.
Go ahead, Ursus. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay. I think it's also strange that we aren't viewing the idea that there's more than one man as something we already had. So we're not saying that every person in the team needs to be in some way unique. That way we can ensure that there are a wide, diverse range of ideas. It's okay for there to be 10 men, but 2 women? it's a little strange. I don't know.
Well, we already have one, Ursus. Jeez.
It's, I don't want to steer this onto gender away from the race topic, but it was really interesting to me that I have a team of 12 people, and all the way across from me at work, there's a manager who has a team of about 12 people. I'm a male manager, she's a female manager. Her team is predominantly female with one or two males on the team. And my team was predominantly male with, at that time, one female on the team. And I guess I recognized that enough to say I want to increase membership gender-wise on the team. And maybe that's not being colorblind to some extent.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. Certainly, yes, it's good to have, I would say, equal amount of gender. That sounds weird to say, but even if you had more females, let's just say, for instance, that you only had one Black female and you increase your white females, there's still a discrepancy because, women differ as well, especially in race too. White women experience different things versus a Black woman would. So it still kind of dives into that.
Yeah, it's just you're increasing. But all you're doing is that you're trying to increase I think I'm gonna make the staying point is that you're increasing the histories and you're also increasing the amount of ways that one can respond to different problems in that workplace. Because if you're increasing, well, I guess I don't have to keep adding to that. But that's all I'm trying to say is that you're adding different problem-solving skills and different histories that are related to the ways in which someone solves a problem and different perspectives. And that, right, you can also talk about the ways in which people may bring about how they have experienced different forms of oppression or different, I don't know, like if I'm trying to, let's say I'm doing like a marketing thing and I'm trying to say, how could I make this product marketable to the widest group of people? Well, if I'm trying to market this to the Asian community, how I'm gonna do it with someone that doesn't have that experience, that doesn't have that? I can't do that. Well, I could, but it may not be as effective.
Right. You can assume things.
We can make a pragmatic argument for it in that sense. Or if we're doing, let's get away from the marketing thing. Let's say we're doing something that's trying to address certain problems in a specific community. Well, you can't tell, like, if you don't understand that culture, that history, you're not gonna get it. So why not pick up people who have experienced that, who also, let's not just pick up a black person. Let's pick up Black male, Black female, Black child or a teenager, so they can tell you, okay, here are the different ways in which all of these different forms of oppression overlap. So then now we can talk about, as Tubb brings up here, intersectional struggle. We can bring, we have perspectives to show that these things overlap, that it's not just one thing, it's multiple things playing off of each other. We can't just reduce it to one thing, like say money or wealth or just race or just sexism or just one single thing.
So I'm like reading through all this. I'm interested from whatever perspective Rex is coming from, but
to slide back into the conversation about colorblindness and how that could relate to the most recent stuff we were discussing, one example of people feeling uncomfortable with a push for diversity is affirmative action programs in school admittance. And some of the articles that I saw showed that people who held a colorblind ideology were more likely to be uncomfortable with these promotional programs to help disadvantaged communities get into these schools.
Right, because I mean that's kind of what we talked about earlier, where they kind of choose to believe that the problem doesn't exist, or that it never existed, or that it's not as big as it used to be, or that it's just not something worth addressing, or whatever the case may be. But it's one way or another, they're basically saying that like we're post-racial, we're now on a level enough playing field to where everything is fair or fair enough, and we shouldn't give anybody special privileges based on their race, is what turning it around and saying that instead of helping them catch up, now they're getting unearned privileges themselves.
I want to try and bring Rex into the conversation because this is fundamentally why this topic was created in the first place. So let's see then. Anything additional that we didn't cover? Tad Bigler.
I'll be right back.
Oh, yeah, sure. So I think we covered most. I know doing my own kind of research about this, there were like a few types surrounding what are different types. And Ursus, you actually touched on like a lot of the categories of what color blindness is. And those few types would pretty much be, oh, there's Rex, there we go. Welcome back, Fox. Those few types would be, one would be we have moved past racism, or a person say they don't recognize race because they moved past racism or a racist society and believe that we live in a post-racial society. And the assumption that seeing race would only invoke harmful situations. So we should just not talk about it at all and just move forward as just one people. And obviously that is just further pushes the harmfulness of just ignoring race in any given situation. Another proponent of it being it puts people on the defensive. Maybe they fear the advancement of another minority group or another group in general having more advantages, I'll say that, over another, which they would perceive as being unearned. Another form of colorblindness would be perceived as so if we make for everyone to be colorblind, that is going to be the perceived solution so that no one eventually experiences racism or being discriminated against because of the color of their skin. That also still furthers the harmfulness of not being able to talk about a situation like this. And the other form, which is more antagonistic, is the whole concept of when you hear Black Lives Matters versus what All Lives Matter. Basically, pushing aside the notion that, you know, you're just creating this inflammatory argument for no apparent reason, and that it shouldn't all just be focused on one group of people that are going through things, because everyone goes through things, which, yeah, everyone does go through things, but there are very, very vast and deep disparities with minority groups versus white people. So just having that blatant ignorance, again, still continues to further harm the conversation.
But yeah, that's actually something I wanted to talk about a little bit, is the whole view of well, everybody goes through stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever I hear everybody goes through stuff or something similar, well, life ain't fair, or not everybody's given a clean lot in life or something, it seems like in that those types of phrases, there's this view that if we can't eliminate it totally, then what's the point of even trying to mitigate it? I guess I kind of want to talk about how would we address, or what are some strategies that we would do to actually try to reduce the impact of such phrases when we're having conversations about struggle. Because we can talk about it, we can say, yeah, this is bad all day, but I kind of want to move into like maybe problem solving strategies.
Well, I mean, obviously, the conversation needs to be had, no matter how difficult they are. Just as how when it's difficult for people, you know, say, for instance, for example, after a mass shooting, people don't want to have that conversation about gun control because, oh, it's too soon. You know, we have to think of the families. We shouldn't talk about this. And we just further push down that goalpost until we continue to see nothing happen. So obviously, it first starts with having the conversation, recognizing and laying out plainly without being argumentative or being intolerant of one another, being respectful enough to say, you know, as a Black woman, this is what I go through. As an Asian man, or as a Hispanic man, or as a, you know, whoever you are, this is what I go through. And this is why it needs to be recognized. Because yes, we all have troubles in life, but my experiences and the history that comes behind the color of my skin compounds the way I am perceived in society. No matter how much I clean myself up, no matter how much I try to make you feel comfortable in this space that we share. So that needs to be acknowledged, and that needs to be had first.
Mm-hmm. I guess to make it a little bit more like live fire. So let's say you've said those things and you're like, yeah, I need to be acknowledged. And then I just come back and be like, well, I'm just not seeing everybody goes through stuff. So maybe, yeah, we can talk about your struggle, but yeah, everybody has struggle, right? Like, I guess I'm trying to get at, and I'm not saying that we can make one for every single situation, but how would we try to move the conversation away from everybody has struggle to addressing the specific struggles of peoples? I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. And I'm not trying to make these questions hard or anything. I'm just trying to.
Mm-hmm. Oh no, they're hard. That's why it's still a problem, right? It's hard. Because, you know, I thought I had an answer, or at least I thought I had a comment.
I was going to say these are hard questions when you're thinking about them. They're amazingly hard when you're not thinking about them. And for most of our history, we have not been thinking about them. We've just been going on autopilot. And now that we're actually addressing them, it's still really, really challenging. So imagine how badly we were doing before.
I find it really odd you make the claim that this is a recent thing that people have been thinking about.
Yeah, I do to some extent, honestly. I really do.
Why do you think it's recent?
Recent in the sense that we're recognizing it's a problem we want to fix, as opposed to I have to figure out how to keep these black people out of my company, which is the other problem we'd have been solving not but 20, 30 years ago, right?
So just
now,
to be clear, when you say we, you meant white people in charge.
yeah, probably. Oh God, I'm so fucking white. Don't look at me, I'm an idiot.
I'm so white.
Although even then, in fairness, that is not the case, right? Like when we look at political movements that were pushing particularly for racial equality, they did include people who looked like you. I mean, they probably wouldn't wear a Boston Red Sox cap because that's the great team in baseball, but there were other people thinking about this, right? I guess my point is it's not like a recent conversation. It might be more recent in terms of what you're aware of. Although, in fairness to you, I think people don't often understand. So I think there are many people who recognize that race is socially constructed. In fact, even Rex said that in the live comments, right? But our conception of race, our contemporary conception of race being like a biologically immutable category and the racial categories that we have, that is, historically speaking, actually fairly recent, right? That conception, we've had conceptions of races, but this idea of these biological categories that are genetically passed on and inherited and are immutable, that's relatively new. That's Enlightenment thinking. And a lot of it had to do with justifying different things that Europeans were doing to other people around the world. But in terms of society, if we were, say, 2,000 years ago, there would still be a concept of race, but it would look very different than what we understand it. So historically, it is a recent conversation, though I don't think that's necessarily how you meant it.
Yeah, I think, you being 16, me being 50, we probably have just a different idea of what recent really means. would be my guess.
Jesus.
That was fair, wasn't it?
16. Oh.
I'm sorry, I was watching the chat. I'm guessing I'm at least a generation and a half older than Tub.
So first,
but that was a funny jab, but I'm also quite serious. I'm a 50-year-old person. Like, I remember when overt racism, even in Southern California, was okay. You wouldn't get shouted down for it. Now you'll get thrown out of someplace for being overtly racist. Wasn't the case when I was a child. That was 40 years ago. To me, that's recent. You might have a different definition. And I didn't mean to taunt you, but I don't know how old you are. But it within my lifetime, to me, is recent.
So I'm just trying to make sure I understand. So you think that I'm 16?
No, I really don't. Like I said, I was poking fun. But I do think you're probably a generation younger than me. So I would guess you're not older than... I'm not going to pry. I'm going to make my guess, keep it to myself.
Man,
I'm a young 50, though, aren't I?
A young 50.
I think Earthus had something.
Yeah, I wanted to attempt to answer Vox's question with a possible response. One thing that you could do is be direct and say that comparing people's problems doesn't solve anybody's problems. Sitting around and saying, yeah, people have problems, doesn't that suck? Doesn't get us anywhere with any problems and is just dismissive. So to act like that is to be dismissive to you.
Mm-hmm.
I say yes.
And your problems.
Yeah. It is dismissive. And the fact that a person like me would want to try and be direct, because if I attempt to be more direct and I put myself in a situation where I want to have a conversation of why Black Lives Matter, people will automatically assume like, oh, okay, so you're just pulling a race card. So me being direct, unfortunately, still puts me at a disadvantage and continues to still harm the conversation, because some people will still perceive during that conversation of me talking about race and race issues as me just pulling out a black card saying, oh, so you're just wanting to say this and want to compare my issues that I go through with yours, but you're saying just because you're black, it's worse. And that's the unfortunate benefit of being direct.
One way to maybe, this is an explanation that helped me, because I used to hold kind of to colorblind views, especially regarding the idea of white privilege, was that it's not that being black makes your life worse compared to all white people. It's that being black is something that some people will treat you badly about, but people aren't really going to treat you badly about being white. You know, society doesn't have this view of being white as negative. And so there are going to be unearned benefits that you have from that, but that doesn't mean that you can't have other issues. It's just that this particular issue won't affect you. In the same way that if someone is, say someone is in a wheelchair, a curb not having a lowered area will affect them. But if I can walk, it won't affect me. That doesn't mean I don't have issues in my life.
But when it comes to, again, being a hiring manager, if I were to interview somebody who came into the office and they were morbidly obese, I would have a hard time not taking that into account when thinking about hiring that person. I would like to think that I wouldn't, and I mean morbidly obese, like they needed some kind of automatic lift to move them from the car to the office for the interview. I would have a hard time not making certain judgments about that person based on their appearance. But now that I say it out loud, that sounds like a wretched thing that we're talking about race. But like seriously, there are things I will consciously, subconsciously.
It's also illegal.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. But I mean, if any of you were hiring a gardener and the person showed up and they were so fat that a mechanical lift had to get them out of their car, would you hire that person to mow your lawn every week? You might stop and think, how are you going to push the lawnmower? There are certain physical characteristics that we would like to ignore that sometimes we can't.
Well, I mean, seeing as
that one's obvious and overt and stupid and silly. But the point is, you guys have all seen the. I know you've seen the studies where they show people pictures of different faces, and you rate them as good or bad, and you have to click, 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 and it shows that we're all racist to some. Yeah.
Yeah, I did that study.
Yeah. I have to be aware. We all have to be aware that we are subconsciously coming to those conclusions, and just be aware of it. Because if we're aware of it, we're still going to fall victim to it. But if we're not aware of it, we're really going to fall victim to it.
Yeah. Apparently, I'm biased against Islam over Christianity. FYI.
So, Giggler, that's a very good example, because it's an example of something that could hurt someone in being hired that isn't race, but doesn't mean that race isn't something that wouldn't also prevent someone from being hired. So it shows that the specific question of, do white people have privilege, or do people see race, is a specific question, and it doesn't address all types of inequalities. It's like it is that specific, and that's a very important part of it.
Do we all, not us here, I mean us as human beings, do we all recognize that attractive people just have an advantage in general? And
I'm just looking.
I think that's what's psychologically true.
What?
I mean,
yeah, but
it's so bad.
Are we overtly trying to stop ourselves from that bias. I don't know that we are necessarily, but when it comes to race, when we recognize ourselves making a distinction there, it's something that now maybe us in this room, ideally all of us, want to recognize and try to change if we see it happening. Where, I don't know, we're all going to have our biases we bring into things. How do we address those? How do we fix them? What do we do about it?
Well, we certainly
Great topic, Jenna.
Oh, please, it's courtesy of Tug. Well, we certainly shouldn't ignore it. And, you know, of course, we all have subconscious biases. I mean, that's fine. I mean, I shouldn't blankly say that's fine, but yes, we all have subconscious biases. And being aware, recognizing that is a good thing. But before I further my point, because I know Tub had something to say that I think he was about to say what I am thinking, so I want him to go first.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, you you were going to say something a moment ago.
I mean, I don't know if this was a thing, but at one point, I guess after Ursus was talking, I was going to reference her back to when Box brought up intersectionality. Well, technically what he said was intersectional, but he was referring to intersectionality. The idea that we have multiple identities, and those identities have different relations to the power structure, right? So to a reference that something Jenna said earlier, a white woman and a black woman aren't going to have the same experiences or the same types of disadvantages. Also, specifically when we talk about privilege, we're not even necessarily saying it's something you have. Like, it is an unearned advantage, but instead, how we usually frame it is that they are things that you don't have to account for, right? They're things that you don't have to deal with. Being part of the default means that there's things that you don't have to consider. Like, if you grew up in America, particularly if you grew up more than, say 15 years ago, if you were white and you needed a hero, there were plenty of heroes on TV and movies, but your choices were more limited if you were anything else.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not necessarily that you had something, it's that you didn't have to worry about other things because you weren't some other identity. And to be clear, I'm not saying this as like a rebuttal to you, but rather an enhancement of the thing that you were saying.
Look at Zoviat is bringing up a response to Stidix about Stidix's little experience where he says that a person was positive and asserting or very confident that something was happening to them because of their race or something. I think that just shows that you have this learned helplessness from the stuff that you go through, and that you're more likely to attribute that to your failings if they are your fault. And I think that shows that if it's if it's bad to the point where we can't even make a good distinction between things that are our fault, things that aren't our fault, or a thing that's a combination between those two, I think that's really saying something. But I don't want to move into that. To focus on the intersectional thing, I don't really I guess I don't really know how. I guess, Tub, could you give us a little bit more information about intersectionality for, well, not just me, but for everybody else? Because I understand it a little bit, but I probably don't get it as good as maybe you would.
I'm wondering if that should be like a whole separate thing, because I've talked about this before, and Jenna, and we've kind of went into it a little bit before, but I think that kind of deserves its own, as much time as we can give to it. It's a fairly large topic, I think.
Okay.
But I mean, if Tub wants to talk about it now, that's fine. But I think we should bring it up again later as well.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
I mean, I can simplify it to just the idea that, to what I said before, right? Like, people have multiple identities, and each of those identities have different relations to power. So a person could have advantages, for example, in one sort of situation, but disadvantages in another, right? So a black man is a man, so there's certain advantages that come with that identity, but they're also black, right? So certain disadvantages, and that if you want to understand someone's place in society, you can't really, at least according to intersectionality, you can't really focus on any one identity because all those identities are at play at the same time.
Mhm.
And Pat Hill Collins, who is one of the most famous proponents of intersectionality, talks about the matrix of domination, which is essentially the kind of calculus that goes into trying to determine a person's individual relation to power.
Does that make sense, Fox?
That
Yeah, it's
answers,
something. Yeah.
that answers it.
I know we, excuse me, I know we had covered something like this on a previous episode, like a month or two ago. I forget what the episode was called, but I think even then I wanted to try and create an episode to where it was just mainly about intersectionality because that's such a big, it deserves its own length of time and discussion to it. So we'll definitely reserve that for another time. But thank you for simplifying that for us, Ted. I lost my train of thought of what I additionally wanted to say. I don't know what Sturgis was talking about. I was trying to remember. Sorry. I was trying to remember whatever that conversation was, and King of Monsters was on it, so I just left that alone. What additional do we have here? Giggler, anything? Or sis? Justin?
I feel like I've said too much already.
No.
Accused of being 16. Disclose myself as a sexist hiring manager.
I mean,
I should probably be quiet for a bit.
Well, sexist and ableist.
oh.
Oh,
Yeah.
and a capitalist.
Thank you for making me feel worse than I felt already. I appreciate it.
Man, you've got 3 cones of domination right now.
Giggler, if this makes you feel any better as far as the disability thing, there are criteria which are considered valid by the US government insofar as needed for the job.
But,
so like the lifting 50 pounds thing.
Yeah, none of that would apply
that
to
is
the
a
work we
question
do.
you're allowed to ask.
Yeah.
No.
None of that would apply to our work.
I'm sorry.
Giggler is actually
No,
working right now, so that's
Yeah, this is my workspace, and
Mhm.
no, it turns out I'm just a jerk. But thank you, I appreciate that.
I mean, just got into like fat shaming and gender all in one. So that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah, like I said, I've clearly said enough.
He also doesn't think Italians are white.
Oh,
Wait,
saw
that was an in joke. Have you ever seen the movie? Is it Bronx Tale? I think it's Bronx Tale, where there's this group of black girls talking, and they're saying, "Would you ever date a white boy?" I would never date a white boy. What about an Italian boy? Why date an Italian boy? It's like Italian somehow, and it's only a point of pride if you're Italian that you're somehow not.
Well,
Okay.
so it's not like we're going to get into it today, but we actually didn't talk about the social construction of race. Like we acknowledge that it was a social construction, but like what counts as white has changed, and it is true that at one point Italians were not white. To be clear, though, that's not the case now, right? So
That's why
you've got to let go of this sort of ancient conception of whiteness.
It was not in the public chat for a reason.
man. Oh my goodness. See, we could save that for the intersectional episode.
Oh,
Although she is Italian, and just for the record, she's a terrible cook. Don't tell her I said that.
there's a lot of things we have on you right now that
Wow.
bring to your wife at any given point in time.
One day you're just gonna have like her say hello to everyone, and it's just gonna unload all at once.
Yeah.
All the things that Giggler told us not to tell you. Do you know where your son's name comes from?
Wow. Sips pink drink.
That's fun.
This is great.
Well, if nothing additional other than making fun of Giggler right now, then we'll kind of wrap it up. Appreciate Vox, you finally joined us. You removed yourself from philosophy night. I feel special.
Yeah, they didn't need me anymore. I defended pragmatism and then I left because they started talking about sense data and other stuff I don't care about. And I was like, I want to talk about something important. So
Well, we're looking forward to future conversations with.
yeah, I'm definitely ready to bring this Marxist perspective to intersectionality. I'm definitely ready.
Who's Marx?
You can beat him up, Tub. You can beat him up. I promise.
I mean, he's always drunk, so he'd probably be easy to beat up.
Wait, wouldn't that make him harder to beat up if he's drunk? Like he was a
No, because he's uncoordinated though.
But he was a drunken brawler, so there's a difference.
Well, he was a drunken brawler when he was younger. When he was older, he spent all his time laying on his couch having his daughter help him with his writing because he wasn't able to get around as easily.
Okay, and we're gonna end this. You two can keep going, but we're ending this.
Hold on, let me make some announcements. Jesus. Okay, well, thank you, Vox, for finally joining us. Thank you, everyone else that contributed to the conversation. Next week, and I think, did we agree about next week, Justin?
Yeah,
okay.
I think on Tuesday.
Yes. Okay, so next week, because I work late on Wednesday, sorry, we're going to move the show to Tuesday evening at the same time. So next week, Tuesday. And then apparently I am a guest talk person on Your Friendly Neighborhood Atheist.
Ethan's channel.
So that's tomorrow. So that should be exciting. I've never seen my face on a poster before, so that's weird. So yeah, I'm doing that tomorrow. But other than that, thank you everyone for the lovely conversation. We should definitely broaden it to future discussions.
All right.
All right.
Next time, let's all get drunk.
Yeah, well, yeah. Oh,